All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Um, you see on the screen the reason we're here. So if that's not why you showed up, you're in the wrong place. But hopefully that's what you're wanting to do is help us comment on this pollution permit discharge or discharge permit to try to help protect Virginia's waters. But before I get rolling, I wanted to thank Kylie, Nick, and Bryn, colleagues from Wild Virginia who are here to help out, and really appreciate y'all being here. So let's jump in. First of all, recognize that this program is being recorded, and of course, you're not showing up on screen or anything, so don't worry about that. We will send a follow-up email with a link to this program so you can definitely look at it later and share it. And we'll also have other information in that email that'll kind of help guide you. So unlike this person taking notes here, you don't have to take a lot of notes. You'll have it at your disposal. So just keep that in mind. While I'm speaking or while we're going through this, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat box, let us know, who you are, why you're here, anything you want to say. Kind of let us know what's going on. And then also, while I'm speaking, if questions come to mind, please put those in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to those at the end, as many as possible. But before I get into kind of the main part of the program, I just wanted to give a little commercial for Wild Virginia. If you're not really familiar with us, I'd like to let you know kind of the range of things we work on. My program deals mostly with water quality, things like what we're doing tonight with PFAS, but also pipeline work and things like that that are threats to our waters. But the other big program we have is called our Habitat Connectivity Program, where we try to make the ecosystems and people work together so that we're protecting both humans and animals from kind of running into each other and causing problems. Um, we also have a program called Clean Water Advocates, which we're really proud of. It's a place where people can get trained to be better, more effective advocates. And then finally, we have a lot of other programs other than things like this, just a range of informational things, experts from different fields that join us. And so now that you're on our email list, you'll get word of those. So keep an eye out. We have almost always a couple of those every month. So why are we here? We're talking about a discharge permit from the Richmond International Airport. And that permit is to cover discharges of stormwater coming off of their sites. And this is a crucial time because right now there's a chance for the public to comment on this permit. Lasts until next Friday, the 31st. And so we think this is good timing if you're interested in helping out with that. We're gonna try to help you know how to do that and what to say. Um, this permit is issued or will be issued by DEQ in accordance with the Clean Water Act and with state rules. And it will cover three separate discharges of water that come off of that big airport site. Two of them go into an area called White Oak Swamp that is part of the Chickahominy River watershed. And so all those waters are affected by the water coming off of those discharges. A third discharge goes into a small stream called Gillies Creek or Gillies Creek, and then flows into the James River. So again, before we get into that deeper, what's PFAS all about? Now, I think probably we've always had some slides like this to give a little bit of a background. I think more and more people understand the importance, the threat of PFAS, and certainly not going to try to get deep into that tonight, but I'll talk a little bit about that, but also how Wild Virginia approaches the very big problem of PFAS. So again, you may or may not know, but PFAS are a group of thousands of chemicals, human-made chemicals that have been produced since about the 1940s. They're in all kinds of products, many of which we really value, things like weather-resistant clothing, food packaging, things like that. They are resistant to water and oils and things like that. So they've been valuable, but at the same time, pose really serious risk and harm. Um, Part of that is that they can cause that harm at very, very minor levels, very tiny amounts can be dangerous. Second, they stick around. They accumulate in people, in wildlife, in the environment. We call them, or many people call them, forever chemicals, just for that reason. They don't easily break down, they don't go away. So, unlike some kind of toxic chemicals or other things that are threats, which might then kind of degrade and not be dangerous, these stick around for a long, long time. And the fact is that we're finding them in many, many places. The estimates are that most of us may well have some form of them already in our bodies, in our bloodstreams. We know that they are in a lot of water bodies, a lot of our drinking water sources, both public drinking water and private wells and things like that. So they're all over, and there are lots of them. Um, so, being such a big and such a widespread problem, Wild Virginia decided that we wanted to kind of zero in one area. Um, Part of what we don't want people to do is to feel like this is such a huge problem that, well, what the heck, there's nothing we can do. But that's the fact is that there is something very useful that we can do, and that is to limit or stop some of these things from being released into the environment, uh, where we already have the authority and the knowledge of how to do that. And so that's why we have focused on these kinds of discharge permits, because, as I say, they are issued routinely for different activities under the Clean Water Act and under state law. And we already have requirements that pollutants, which these are, be controlled. So that's why we target this. And we want you to understand that we can make a difference here. That's why we do this. So again, the permitting system under which this Richmond Airport permit will be issued is under both federal and state law, and it is designed to control basically whatever pollutants are or may be in the water that's being released to our state waters. Um, and of course, PFAS are part of that. The discharge permits can cover things like your municipal wastewater plant that's in your community. Different industries have their own direct discharges to our streams. And then, of course, places where you have stormwater, like the airport, that is related to certain kinds of activity. And so that's why we're talking about this in relation to Richmond Airport. So we started to understand that PFAS was a serious problem in the Chickahominy River watershed way back in 2021. And thanks to the folks at Newport News Waterworks, they were noticing PFAS showing up in the water that they're finding in the Chickahominy River, which is where they get the supplies for a lot of folks, pretty large population in that part of the state. So they kind of raised the alarm and got together with the Virginia Department of Health, the Virginia DEQ, Henrico County. They all kind of got together and said, hey, obviously there's something going on here. Let's figure it out. Let's do some monitoring, try to get a grasp on how big the problem is and where it's coming from. And so that was an important move, and thankful that they found it at that time. Um, One of the things that they found, of course, was, and you see that map, I don't know how easy that is to pick out, but you see all those yellow circles, which mean that those were the highest levels of total PFAS. And you'll see that they range down from on the east southeast side of Richmond. That is exactly where the White Oak Swamp and Chickahominy River flow. And so clearly that kind of zeroed us in on that area. And you'll see that long quote there from the report. And one of the things they said at that time already, they warned that certain people, sensitive populations, should avoid eating fish from those areas at that time. So all of a sudden, that raised a really serious concern and a really, really serious warning that limited or should have limited people's access to something that they have a right to, which is to consume fish in the state. Um, Later, much later, unfortunately, it took quite a while, the Virginia Department of Health then also issued a formal fish consumption advisory for parts of the Chickahominy River watershed for one of the PFAS forms, one of the chemicals called P or whose acronym is PFOS. Don't ask me to quickly tell you the whole name, but it's one of the most common ones that people know about. And it was showing up in fish, and it is certainly in the waters in that area in very, very high levels. And it's high enough that certain kinds of fish just shouldn't be eaten at all. Others, sorry for my voice, others, the amount that people eat, it's recommended that they limit those amounts. So knowing what you've seen from that map, knowing that we've got this serious problem, again, where is it coming from? Why are these waters being so badly affected? And again, one source that became, a real or somewhere where we needed to look was the Richmond Airport because it sits there right at the headwaters of White Oak Swamp and the Chickahominy River. Um, it is almost certainly, or certainly not the only source of PFAS. As I say, we're finding PFAS in so many areas, and there are lots of sources. But we know that airports like the Richmond Airport are a serious source of PFAS in our waters, in part because they have used these firefighting foams for decades. In fact, they've been required to do so because those are necessary for certain kinds of fires, the kind of fires that you have when aircraft and jet fuel and those kinds of things combust. It takes something special to be able to put those fires out. Um, but the fact is that those kinds of foam, we know have multiple forms of PFAS in them. But I'll say again, they used them for decades because they had to, because they were required to, and because they were the things that would be effective. Not only did they use them when there were actual fires, or do they use them when there are actual fires, but they've been required to test those systems through time to make sure they were ready. So all those activities were releasing PFAS into the environment in one way or another. And it was kind of inevitable that it would get farther out into the environment. Um, and so, to their credit, the folks at the Richmond Airport Authority um, proposed and has carried out a fairly extensive study of their sites, of the three discharges that come off of their property, and also sampled soils and groundwater on their property. There was also some study done by the Air National Guard, which has shared the property that the airport is on. And again, we know that there were sources from the foam. There may be other sources on those sites, but that's certainly one of the ones that is of, or the one that is surely there and of great concern. And as I say, we know that there's serious contamination in the surface water, in groundwater, and in soils. Um, it, Let me just go back to this. I'll say again, we have every time Wild Virginia has looked seriously at one of these permits, we've thought about, um, the people who are operating these facilities. In most cases, they didn't create the problem. And that's the case here with the folks who run the airport. And we like to emphasize that because we're not saying that somebody went out there and intended to release these things and cause hazards in the environment. Um, Really, our focus in these permitting cases is to say, okay, we had a problem or we have a problem. Let's figure out the best way to deal with it. And our primary focus is on getting the regulators to do what they are supposed to do, which is to recognize the problem and then use all the authorities they have to try to solve it. Now, in looking at the amounts of these chemicals that are in the water or in these discharges, there are a number of kind of levels that you can look at to decide whether they're a problem or not. I'll say that the first two that are listed there in that table, PFOA and PFOS, first of all, those two are considered likely carcinogens causing cancer. And the fact is that there's really no safe level of exposure to those kind of chemicals. In fact, EPA, when they set drinking water levels, said, um, a certain level is a maximum contaminant level, but a recommended level is zero for those two. So you can just see there that they consider very small numbers of at least those two to be of great concern. Now, of all the other types that show up, um, there are different levels, or and in many cases we don't know how various levels will affect people or wildlife. This table, again, though, it presents three of those, the two I mentioned and another, PFBS. And the numbers that are listed there are ones that the United States EPA came up with because they did a pretty sophisticated analysis and said, if you find these kinds of levels in your streams, then people who eat fish or shellfish or drink water from those streams, if the levels exceed these kinds of numbers right here, then there's a real threat to public health. Um, so we think these are some of the most important numbers, some of the most important kind of levels that we should be shooting for, and that any discharge that might exceed these are something that should be prohibited. And in fact, those numbers you see there for PFOA and PFOS are really smaller than we can even detect with the current analytical methods if you take a sample to the lab, you probably can't reliably measure that small an amount, which means there should be a non-detectable level coming off of these discharges. Now, in their study at the airport, those folks found something between a dozen and 2 dozen of different forms of PFAS in each of those discharges. So these are just examples of some of the ones there. But again, at least those first two are some of the ones that are most widely known and ones that show up most often. But so you take those really small numbers, and again, you'll see there it says NG per L and PPT. Uh, Parts per trillion is what that stands for, which is a very, very small amount. And it's even fractions of a part per trillion. So what we did, we had a technical analysis done. We contracted with a PhD expert and had an analysis done that looked at a lot of the data from Richmond Airport. We didn't have every bit of it at the time, but using that, our consultant put together this table. And what they found was that the levels that were there in these three separate discharges that go into separate water or parts of the water bodies, um, that they exceeded those for PFOS, they exceeded those numbers that we're shooting for by anywhere from tens of thousands to millions of times. So you can see the magnitude of the problem here and how serious it really is. So again, we know there's a dire problem and we need to deal with it. So what are we going to do? Um, DEQ has drafted, and we have copies of the proposed permit that DEQ has prepared. And unfortunately, we have to conclude that it's just not living up to the legal requirements in federal or state law. Um, we will say that it includes monitoring requirements, ongoing monitoring at the airport, which is absolutely appropriate. And so that's a step forward. That has not always been the case in these permits. So that's something that we appreciate and believe has to go forward. The other thing that is in this permit is kind of a schedule for Richmond Airport to come up with kind of a management plan. But it's a little bit nebulous at this point what that will be. And we still don't think that that's anywhere near adequate to make sure that the protections are in place. Excuse me. Um, what really is supposed to happen is that DEQ is supposed to do an analysis as to whether certain kinds of limitations, and we're talking X amount is the most that can come out of this discharge. That's what we mean by limitations. And DEQ is supposed to do analyses on two kinds of limitations, what we call technology-based and water quality-based limitations. Now, you don't need to understand the details of what those are all about. The biggest thing is that they need to be set at a level where we're not creating risk to people eating fish, shellfish, or drinking water downstream. Um, we have something called water quality standards that say how we protect these streams. And one of the things they say is you cannot create circumstances with a discharge that are toxic or dangerous to humans or wildlife, or that prevent people from using their water bodies the way they should be able to use them. I gave the example of those fish consumption warnings and then the formal advisory. And that's basically the definition of denying people the use that they should have of their own waters. And so we know there's a problem. We know that water quality standards have been violated. And we know because we've seen what is coming off of the airport properties that it is causing or contributing at least to those problems. Um, which means that DEQ should be setting limits in this permit for those through three discharges coming off the site. Um, the way we try to insist on that is during this period through next Friday, we submit comments spelling out what we think needs to be done and why, and at the same time ask for a public hearing. DEQ's rules say that if enough people in the public ask for a public hearing, that one will be held. And the great value of that is it gives more people the chance to be informed. We're glad to be able to get this word out through webinars and things like this, but having a public meeting or a public hearing that's held by the state, that's widely publicized, can bring even more people in and let everybody hear both DEQ's story and those of us who are concerned about what's going on. So if you're going to file comments, we suggest that you do two things. You say what you think of the draft permit, and we'll give you some clues about that. And you also say, yes, we need to have a public hearing. Now, as a general matter, anybody can submit comments. And the fact is, you don't have to have any special background or training or credentials to do that. You'll see on the right here, if you do have some kind of special knowledge, if you're a scientist or somebody who knows about those specific areas in detail, that's great. You can bring that expertise into your comments, and it makes it gives them a special value. But don't think that you have to have that kind of background. Anybody who cares about these waters, anybody who uses them, anybody, frankly, who just wants to solve this problem overall has the right and has a valid interest in doing these comments. And so don't think that you don't know enough because you do, and we're going to help you feel comfortable with that. Um, Now, DEQ's regulations do spell out specific things that you're supposed to include in your comments. And they say that we have to get at least 25 people to ask for a public hearing to show that there's, quote, significant public interest. So that's part of what we need your help with to really show them how strong the interest in this is. Um, but again, knowing what those rules are is our business, and that's why we want to help you understand it. We don't want you to have to comb through the regulations and figure out all the details. So just be warned that these some of these other slides that are coming up are kind of complicated, um, but you don't need to understand every little piece of it. We're going to help you. You know what to do and why. Um, just to say, if you're going to submit comments, certainly you can do them by postal mail. You can hand deliver them, but the vast majority of people do them by email. It's okay if you just put your comments in the body of the email, or if you like, attach a document to that email. Either one is just as good. And when you do comments, you're just going to be referencing that draft permit with the number and the name. That's really all you need to do to make sure they know what you're addressing. Um, so let's jump a little bit about, what you're supposed to say or what you need to say and how to go about it. Um, these bullets kind of spell out the things that kind of have to be there. Obviously, basic things like your name, email, all those things. A simple reason for your request, and again, we'll talk more about that, um, and the facts that are behind your request. And then specific references to what's in the permit. Again, I've already kind of touched on those and we'll continue with that. Um, when you're making your request for a public hearing, this is kind of the wording that they talk about. And one of the key things is it talks about your interest. What we mean there is not just I'm interested in this thing, it's that I have a reason that this is of value to me. It could, of course, be an economic interest, but any interest, the fact that I may recreate in these waters is a very valid and legally protectable interest that you have a right to assert. Um, the fact that you may recreate in these areas and don't want to be, whether you're going to eat the fish or the shellfish or just hang out, just boat or swim or whatever. That's an important interest. And so bringing those things in, they're valid and they are part of what you should bring forward. And that this kind of amplifies that a little bit more. If you know any of these water bodies, if you spend time around them, if you have, a home or whatever in those areas, that means you have a special interest. But also more generally, if you want to keep these PFAS out of our waters, these and all the others, you have a right to say so. And one of the interests, no matter where you are, even if you're never going to visit Gillies Creek or White Oak Swamp or the Chickahominy River, um, one interest you have is seeing that DEQ is living up to its duties. And because I guarantee you, if PFAS, if you're not going to deal with these water bodies, PFAS is in some areas that you do care about. It is very likely to show up in your watershed or your community or your area. So that's part of the reason if we get this fixed in some permits, then that can have kind of a ripple effect across the state. That's what we're shooting for. So a little bit more specific about the reasons why we would request a hearing and why we would oppose this permit specifically. Again, the draft permit is not supported by the kind of analysis that DEQ is required to do. Um, when you're in school and doing your math homework, they said, I don't care if you just have the right answer, you got to show your work. Well, DEQ has to show its work, and they haven't done so here. They haven't gone through the steps of saying, just like I did earlier, here's the amount that we're finding, here's what's dangerous, and here's, whether it's a problem and what we're going to do about it. Because DEQ has not proposed specific limitations on these discharges for the forms of PFAS that we know are there, we cannot we cannot be sure they cannot ensure that our water quality standards are being met in those water bodies. Um, and Okay, I'm just reading my quote there, trying to remember what that was all about. Um, so one of the things they asked for is how and to what extent your interest would be directly or adversely affected by the permit. Again, if you use those water bodies, and that's a little bit more obvious, but don't think that that's the only kind of interest that matters here. Um, the fact that these things are being discharged here and in many other places, and they're not being properly regulated, that's of great interest to all Virginians. So again, back to the facts. I've already gone through some of those, and again, we wade through these sampling reports. We look at the data, so you don't have to. But we can make all that stuff available. What it does show is that PFAS containing substances are being discharged in all three of the discharges from from the airport area in levels that are dangerous, that are really problematic. Um, we know that in part because we've seen the data downstream and in the discharges. We also know that there's a huge problem because, as I discussed, we've got these fish consumption advisories. So we know there's significant danger there. The health department experts have said so. Um, and our water quality standards say you cannot cause or contribute to conditions that would be toxic or dangerous to humans and wildlife. And so that link between what's coming off this site and those dangers is obvious. Um, so that's kind of the factual basis for what we're getting at here. So then when we're talking about what should DEQ, what must DEQ do because of these deficiencies, they must amend this permit to include the kind of conditions, the kind of limitations that do ensure us that our waters are going to be protected. But one of the things I always say is don't hide the ball. Right up front in your comments, um, we recommend that you tell them, I oppose the permit as it stands today. I want DEQ to go back and redraft it and do it in a way that we think is necessary and legally required. And I want a public hearing. So don't hesitate to stress those right at the front. Um, and one of the things, again, as I said, we're not expecting to throw all this at you in this forum and just have you go off and figure it all out by yourself. One of the things that we routinely do is we come up with kind of a template that helps you, figure out how to place this information in there. And so we will be providing that in the follow-up to this webinar. Essentially, it kind of spells out some of those factual things that I've mentioned and some of the kinds of information that DEQ says are required. But then the most important thing really is for you to fill in why this is of significant interest to you, why you have values and concerns that are presented by this situation. When you submit comments, if you're prepared to do that right now, that's where they're going to go to. The person at the DEQ Richmond Regional Office. And remember, the deadline is next Friday, the 31st. Plenty of time to get there. I will say that while Virginia is absolutely not the only group that is working on this, there's a whole kind of coalition of groups that are cooperating and putting together comments. We certainly will have our own extensive comments that bring in a lot of the technical analysis and the legal arguments in much more detail. But we really depend on you also to be part of that picture. And as I keep saying, we're going to send you a follow-up. And please share that information with folks. A lot of times people say, well, I can't attend the webinar tonight, but I'd like to know what's going on. One of the things is that everybody registered will get the follow-up information, whether they could make it tonight or not. But it's also useful if you share it with friends and family and other people that might be interested. We need that word of mouth to get out there. And if you want help, certainly write that down if you weren't taking good notes. Otherwise, write my email down. And you're absolutely free to send me questions as we go forward. But for now, I can also try to handle some of the questions that you might have. And I can see from the numbers down there that there must be some waiting for me. So maybe Nick and Bryn, if you can help just kind of take turns, maybe reading off some of those, help me figure out what's there? I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. The first question, how have PFAS affected the fish population numbers as well as their health? And that was asked, I think, on the slide about the Chickahominy River, but I assume overarching as well. Yeah.
Right. It's a complicated question. What we know, there aren't nearly as many studies on the actual effects on the wildlife, on fish or other kinds, things like amphibians or even waterfowl. But the research that has been done shows some pretty serious effects. So I can't tie specific health effects to the fish and the Chickahominy to those numbers. What we know is that's also a very big threat. We actually had a webinar, wow, a year and a half maybe ago, or maybe 2 years ago, where we brought in some wildlife experts who have done those kinds of studies. So there's no question that it's a serious risk. We just can't necessarily spell it out for those particular water bodies. So thanks for that. What else we got?
You have another, is there signage in the affected waters regarding the fish consumption advisories?
That's a good question, and I won't say that I know for sure. I haven't heard that there is, but that might be one thing that folks should ask the health department about. And I'm going to look into that. That's a good question. That's one of the things that these kind of formal announcements that the health department or whatever make. It's kind of like those legal notices in those old newspapers which nobody reads. I am afraid that the word does not get out the way that it should. So that's a good question. I'm going to look into it, and I would encourage people who use those areas to maybe start asking some of those questions too, because people have a right to know, and I fear that a lot of folks who go there and fish and eat fish probably don't know. So thanks for that.
It looks like there's another one in the main chat as well. The airport built a stormwater management facility downstream of the airport. It diverted surface water into basins before discharging it back into the White Oak swamp. Is this helping with the water quality in White Oak?
Any any of those kinds of things that have been put there are probably not adequate to do much for the PFAS. A lot of sites have done good things to try to treat or control their stormwater, but in general, those have been more effective or going to be more effective for things like sediments and some other problems. Um, it just takes some fairly specific kinds of treatment to deal with the PFAS. And part of the thing, just to get a little technical here, is part of the thing in dealing with stormwater or any kind of polluted water is to try to keep these substances from contacting that water to begin with. And again, I've given the folks at the airport a bit of credit already, and I'll give them a little more, is that they have found at least one place on their site where there was significant soil contamination. And what they did is they went in and kind of built a structure to segregate that contaminated soil so that the stormwater is not going to be carrying it away and it's not going to be getting into the groundwater. So that's probably the most effective way of protecting stormwater. Um, but also, if you're trying to keep it out of a discharge or get it out before it goes into the stream, there's other methods. Activated carbon is one kind of treatment unit that can be used. Again, the simple answer is that normal stormwater management uh, facilities or structures probably don't give you much good for PFAS. So, anything else?
Yes, we just got one more. I think it's a follow-up. Is the VDH or DEQ responsible for putting up signage?
There again, I don't know the answer to that. If there is supposed to be signage, I would assume it would be the health department. Um, but I honestly am just not aware. I know that I have been to other water bodies that have health or fish consumption advisories and have never seen that kind of signage. But I can't guarantee that it's not there. I just don't know. But again, you've given me something important to follow up on. Anything else? No? You guys are quiet tonight. Um, well, again, I appreciate everybody being here, and it's just really important. And the one thing that I just always, I mean, many people who hear about these chances to comment, to be involved in these processes, their first response is, I don't know enough. Well, or I'm not an expert. And I'll just reiterate again that should not be a barrier for you jumping in here. Um, and then the other thing again is wherever you are in Virginia, wherever you care about in Virginia, getting this problem fixed is going to benefit us all. And I will say that having looked at data, not just from this site, but from many discharges around the state, this is a very, very important one for us to get right because the numbers here are really high and really dangerous. And, I told or I said earlier when this problem was first discovered that the folks who run the Newport News public water supply are the ones that first raised some alarm. And that's because pretty far downstream in the Chickahominy River is where they take water out to then put in their reservoirs and serve to their customers in a bunch of those localities. Just the fact that it's down fairly far from the airport does not mean that this is not a threat to all of those water users. So if you get your water from the Newport News Water Authority, you have reason to be concerned. I understand, and I don't have documentation of this, but I understand that the folks at the Newport News Water Authority are already looking at or planning to put in that kind of treatment that I spoke of, the activated carbon. And if that's the case, what that means is that everybody who's a customer of that water authority is going to have to help pay for solving a problem that they also didn't create here. So that's something that obviously should be a concern. Um, but one last thing I'll say, unless there's any other questions that popped up, is that I just spent a lot of time looking at tens of thousands of pieces of data of PFAS in streams all over Virginia. And although this is one of the worst that we've seen, um, it's it's in waters that you care about in levels that are can be kind of scary. And so, but I'll just finish by saying, don't let that make you inactive. Don't give up hope because we do have the chance to help solve this. Okay, Brand, you got something else?
Yeah, I think we just had a clarification that just came in asking, have you identified a tenant source other than the Air Guard or Army Guard?
Well, the one place that we suspect is there was and I don't think it's active now, but I might be wrong. Henrico County had a firefighter training facility kind of in that area. And that again is another kind of place where these kinds of substances may well have shown up. Um, but I noted that two of the discharges, or that some of the discharge goes into the White Oak Swamp in Chickahominy, but I'll point out again that some of them go to the James River, um, which I'm sure has many potential sources of PFAS also. And, I'll say that we are all contributing PFAS to the environment. It is a given that most of those municipal wastewater plants that I mentioned earlier probably have some PFAS. So there are lots of sources, but again, this one is large enough and obvious enough that it's time to do something about it now. So,
There's one more question in the chat.
Right.
It's asking if you would consider speaking at one of the city council meetings, which I assume is in reference to Richmond City Council.
uh, please contact me and we can look at that. There, as I say, there are other groups and other probably people who live in Richmond who could also help with that. Some of the Sierra Club folks and some other groups who are based there would be able to help. But as you can tell, I'm ready to talk about this stuff at about any time. But give me an email. Make sure can you put my email in the chat again, just to make sure that everybody has it. Okay. Did we get it? You want me to put it in there? I'm doing it. See who can do it first. Okay. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, we'll close it up here. Again, thanks folks for being here and look out for that follow-up email and please weigh in and encourage your contacts to do that also. Thanks again for you guys helping out. All right. Take care, everybody. I'm going to close it up.